I'm David Glazer, and I'm chairing a panel with a few colleagues here to talk about industry's role with the Global Alliance. When the Global Alliance was first started, the first set of members were all, as Peter remembers our conversations, the first set of members were all nonprofit organizations of various sorts, but there was a lot of interest from industry right at the beginning, as there was from all of you here. And I think you told me it's a big third of the members right now. 41% are from industry, so we wanted to put together the next 45 minutes to talk about some of the perspectives, and you'll see that we have very different, we're in very different businesses and very different things that we do, but we have a lot of common areas where we see opportunities for the Global Alliance and opportunities to help with the Global Alliance. All right, so I'm going to let each person introduce themselves when they get up. I just have this one slide, and then we're going to do it. Format here is we're each going to talk for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. And I think the room is not shy, and there'll be plenty, but we can talk amongst ourselves if people would prefer that. So the prompt that we just settled on for each other is we thought what would be most interesting is really exploring that two-headed arrow in the middle there and saying, what are the flows back and forth? What do we see as in our respective businesses are ways that the Global Alliance can help enable the growth and health and opportunities for our business, and reciprocally, what are the things that we're doing that we think can contribute to the goals and missions of the Global Alliance. So the prompt to each of us was prepare 2 slides. You'll see there are some overachievers in the group, but we also all have 5 minutes. So Andrew, why don't you take it away, and up to you if you're comfortable sitting or standing.
I guess I can sit. My name is Andrew Urey. I'm the CEO of ACTX. And what we do at ACTX is we build actionable genomic decision support into electronic health record. And our thesis is that there's a last mile barrier that prevents genomics from reaching the clinician. You can't really learn genomics like you learn most medical things. You're not going to know what a particular RS number means lower a dosage. And you need computer decision support. And the way to make that practical is to build it into the point of care in the tool the doctors, at least in the developed world, are using now, electronic medical record. So it should be built into the tool they already use. On the other hand, EHRs generally are not very well suited for genomics. They are not generally good at storing genomic information or doing decision support based on it. And so our approach was to build a web service that can be built into the EHR. And we have now done this with most of the major EHRs in the US. And we take care of the storage, the processing, and the content. And of course, the individual institutions can customize as well. And what this means, drug genome interactions, actionable risk alerting, and a built-in genomic profile. So as far as our alignment with the Global Alliance, what we see as a Global Alliance is focused on interoperability, and standards-based interoperability we think is critical. The ability to exchange genomic data from valid sources is really very important. And specifically, we look at the VCS specification, which you are working on. While it's in pretty good shape, it does need further enhancement. An example, there are genetic use cases that are not well covered. For example, star allele calling and so forth. It doesn't really have a standardized place for patient demographics. And we've worked in the past with other standards bodies, and we found that a standard is not sufficient. That if you really want plug-and-play interoperability, you need a lockdown implementation guide. So it's how you use that standard, and all the details it takes to make a standard work is important. And I think you're at the beginning of that, but it's something we would definitely suggest working together on. We're also interested in BAM. And then another, sorry, am I already out of time? No. Is on the consent side. I know there's a lot of work going on standardization of consents, and obviously if you're going to share genomic data clinically, the more that consents are standardized, the easier that's going to be. Here's my last slide. I did just 2 as requested. So what do we do? We take those VCFs and we turn them into precision medicine through a decision support platform. And that means genomic decision support, fully integrated electronic health record, and normal clinician workflow. As I mentioned, most of the major US EHRs are partnering with us. And what that means, for example, is that as you write a prescription inside the EHR, and at least in the US, almost all prescriptions are electronic, The physician gets an alert for adverse reactions or efficacy or dosing if it's relevant. And we separately alert them for serious non-medicational actionable risks. Our focus is on what we call actionable genomics. That's the part of genomics where there's something the doctor and patient can do. And I guess I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you. So on to Jonathan from SciAps.
Thank you. So I'm slightly more ambitious. I have 3 slides. I don't know how many Steve has, but knowing Steve, he has many more. A few more. So what we do at SciAps is we're focused on democratizing access to precision medicine through a software platform. So there are 4 elements of what we do when we work with a health system in implementing precision medicine. There is integration of comprehensive clinical and molecular data, decision support at point of care, mostly today focused on the oncology domain. The third part is all of the clinical workflow and care coordination around precision medicine. So think about things like molecular tumor boards or genetic case review boards. And then the final bit is the learning health system, where we pull together all of the clinical, molecular, treatment, and outcomes information across all the patients today in cancer in the health systems that we work with, and we help that information be used for clinical improvement today. So as you can tell from what I'm talking about, what Andrew was talking about, and what the other speakers are going to talk about, it is incredibly important for the corporate environment to actually have meaningful standards for data that have teeth that people abide by. I'll echo everything Andrew said, and I'll add on my additional item, which is when you think about a clinical practice environment, you might not be dealing with a VCF. You might have laboratories that you guys work with or run who are sending out a 20-page PDF report. This is still happening today, and some of you in this room are guilty of the process of turning beautifully structured genomic information into a 20-page PDF, going to the fax machine and faxing it. From our side, we say that this is simply unacceptable. This is unacceptable if we're going to all achieve a future of precision medicine. And it's unacceptable if we're going to work together to share information across health systems and across research environments so that we can make progress for patients today. So that is my plea to all of you to stop using your fax machines for genomic information. And that's my provocation of the day. The second component is what we're going to do. So we in industry have real-world use cases, and we care about scalability. If you think just from a selfish perspective on this, we don't want to have to come up with our own special data specs. We don't want to have to come up with our own special interchange mechanisms. This is not what we want to be doing in industry. We want to focus on innovating around clinical delivery, innovating around decision support, et cetera. We don't want to focus on the basics of interoperability. So let's all work together on this, and you have our commitment that we are actually going to implement the standards that GA4GH comes up with. We're also going to contribute to this because we've been doing it for a while. The second part that I want to focus on is data sharing, and specifically focusing on the non-technical implementation standards. So there's a lot to be done in terms of consent process, et cetera, where frankly many of the health systems that are not in this room really don't have the foggiest idea how to start. They're looking to the people in this room to be the leaders to help them understand how to scale these processes. And that's something that we can help with, we can help enforce, and we can bring those use cases to the table.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me here. And I'm going to try and give a little bit of the perspective from the laboratory, the laboratorian. So there are lots of different types of clinical labs out there. There are small local labs inside hospitals, particularly in academic health centers. There's large reference laboratories. There are, sort of medium-sized reference laboratories like our own. Historically, these people didn't share a lot of data. not between the labs, not even really with the clinicians other than in the 20-page faxes that Jonathan just mentioned. There's all kinds of reasons they cite for this. They say, oh, well, we're waiting till we publish it, or that we can't because of HIPAA in the US, or they're the reasons they say, and there's what may be the real reasons under there, and I won't read too much into that. But you might say, well, then why would a laboratory, so Invitae is one lab, and there are certainly others, that has made the strategic decision to share lots of data, basically everything we possibly can within the law. Because we believe that data hoarding fundamentally retards the entire practice of precision medicine and our entire industry. Right? It limits access, it reduces the quality and effectiveness of care, it does not deliver the best patient care possible. Conversely, getting data out there, getting the entire community to look at it, review it, find fault with it, help us all get better, improves confidence. It will help physicians learn how to use this sort of genomic and genetic data better, and it's going to help the payers realize that it really is worth paying for these kinds of tests and incorporating them into day-to-day routine patient care. And that's kind of the vision that I think we see, and I know we're not alone in that particular regard. But, you know, so what specifically can we do as the Global Alliance to try and make that happen? Well, you've heard about a number of these efforts already, and in gruesome detail if you've been here the last 2 days. You know, we've talked about the BRCA Challenge and the BRCA Exchange this morning. Those are crucial efforts. The Cancer Gene Trust on the somatic side, Matchmaker Exchange, particularly for rare idiopathic diseases. The registered access model that was mentioned by Bartha this morning is going to be super important so that we can get somewhat richer data out there than we are really at liberty to push out publicly in a complete, you know, any Girl Scout can download it type format. Consent, ethics, those have already been raised, and of course, having standard, you know, formats and mechanisms to communicate this information is going to be crucial. But the most important thing for everyone in this room to do is to encourage people to share data. Or if they're not sharing data and they're you know, not willing to, then, you know, start thinking like a teenage girl, if you will. Let's call these people out and say, hey, why aren't you doing this? You know, it is better for the entire field, including the field that you company are profiting from. Why can you not join us all in doing this? Let's see what we can do. And you know, the good news is that again, many are participating. Notably, some major labs are not, and that's unfortunate. But let's call them out. Let's get to the point where clinicians choose to buy tests, they choose to buy services from people who are sharing data and trying to push this whole field forward. Now, the one thing I also encourage people to do is be a little careful. Sometimes people will say they're sharing data where when you really dig into the details, not so much. In fact, Melissa Klein and I in a conversation came up with a new term for that. So does anyone here know the term greenwashing? You know, when a big oil company, for example, tries to make it appear environmentally friendly what they're doing when perhaps it's not, well, we came up with share washing. And, you know, like I say, I don't want to name any names here, but I think this is all. Let's try to, you know, if people are share washing, let's make sure, you know, we make it apparent what they're really doing, and then, you know, we let the free market decide who really is doing the right thing for the community, and where should the doctors and the, you know, notably the insurance companies and the state-run health systems outside the U.S. Send their business.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm going to do a bit from the Verily perspective, and then we'll open it up to discussion amongst everyone. So Verily, for those of you who don't know, Google a little while ago, about a year ago, created an umbrella company, Alphabet, that is an umbrella over Google and all of its sister companies. And Verily is one of the Alphabet companies focused on life sciences. So I've been working on Google Genomics for the last 3 years, took that team and moved it into the bigger canvas of working on all sorts of life science projects inside Verily. So started engaging with the Global Alliance right at the beginning, 3 years ago, and then have continued that work in this new context. And you're going to see a lot of common themes here across, from the virtuous cycle that we are trying to get going and that's starting to turn around, about how the Global Alliance is helping each of us, and then how we all can contribute back. The things that from my parochial perspective I care most about, which happen to line up with the things I care most about from a global perspective, which is always nice, but the things I care about specifically are really in these three areas. And no one of them is any more important than the other, because it doesn't work unless we get all three right. And the first one is all of the soft stuff, all of the policies and documents and mechanisms that make it possible and make it easy for people who want to share, because to Steve's point, maybe not everyone wants to share, but we can at least take away the excuses. Right? And that's something that's in all of our interests to do. There are going to be fundamental choices to share and not to share. Let's make sure that anyone who's making a choice is making it for that fundamental reason, not for some confusion or optical reason where they're trying to come across and share wash. So the sorts of things, and we talked about all this earlier today, and I was happy to see some of the head nodding in the room around things like moving towards a simpler and therefore easier to work in world where where standard forms of consent and standard forms of data access and the matching mechanisms between them with the ATOM project and other things like that are possible. Coming up with standard guidelines for data security, all of which, in the green there, all of which to me comes down to, if my organization wants to share data, it should be as easy for me as the chief information or chief data or chief medical officer of the organization to say, oh, look, here's a toolkit of the globally accepted way to share data. We're going to pick option B on consent and option A on data access, and yes, we conform to the recommended security guidelines. Therefore, I'm covered. I'm doing what I already want to do the right way. And right now, everyone has to invent that from scratch, and it's painful for the people doing it, and it's painful for those of us who are trying to receive these individually invented rubrics and mechanisms for sharing. So that's on the policy side. On the technical side, again, for people who've been here for the last little bit, we've covered that in a lot of depth, but all of the mechanisms to say, once I'm ready to share, once I've checked the boxes to know I have permission to share, how do I do it? How do I take my tools and package them up, so tools that Andrew wants to, Andrew has built and made available to the world, Jonathan can run? How can we do it so tools that Augusto has been built for Genomics England, we can use inside the Precision Medicine Initiative, and vice versa, right? So standardizing how we package the tools, standardizing how we access the data are both critical. And there's one bullet that got truncated on this display. No, it's got truncated. But the third section, the third bullet at the bottom there is, in addition to a policy framework and a technical framework, there's a moral framework. And Bartha, I think, has always been nailing this, and again said it beautifully earlier today around the framework for responsible sharing. And in the language of do this and you're okay, and do this and you can play, the third leg is do the right thing. And I think the Global Alliance is uniquely positioned to really reinforce globally that it is the right thing in most circumstances to share, and here's how you can do it, both in a way that checks the policy boxes and the technical boxes. Okay, so those are the things that I'm excited about seeing happen. Back one, there we go, back forward one, yeah. Those are the things that I'm excited about seeing happen from the Global Alliance. The things that we verily are trying to take advantage of there and are building on work in progress, and as the standards in our work come together, it'll be more interoperable. First is obviously support publishing data using these standards. And we are working with both government projects like the ones mentioned here, and nonprofit projects like Autism Speaks has a autism genomics database, and commercial projects like one that we're running ourselves, the Baseline Study, where we're running our own longitudinal study. And we want to, because it's easier for us as well as the right thing, we want to publish all this data in exactly the same format with exactly the same tools. That makes life better for everyone. We're doing it as much as possible now. As the standards and tools evolve, we're going to keep moving the projects we control towards the standards and vice versa, right? We want to have them come together. Second is around tools. So a recent example is just earlier this week, we published up, working with the Broad Institute, published standard documentation for how you can take Broad's GATK best practices using the Broad's workflow definition. That's the one that they've built for how they recommend running it and how they run their GATK tool set, and publish that up as a how-to for how you can run that yourself in the cloud using standard open source tools for orchestration, which are working with the containers and workflows task team to become the standard. Not quite standard right now, so the two things are moving towards each other, but open source and running, and working with the folks at Santa Cruz and elsewhere to have that become official. And then finally, putting it all together, the thing that we're excited about doing is support the kinds of commons initiatives, both in the very specific sense that Phil Bourne talked about this morning with the NIH data commons, and in the spiritual and general sense of that type of initiative is exactly what I certainly saw in my mind's eye when I read the initial one-page charter for the Global Alliance. And that supporting those kinds of commons is what we're excited about doing and adding what we can do on top of the policy and technical frameworks. So we're going to stop there and open it up to questions. So anyone who wants to ask any of us or just get us to opine, and we'll see if we can disagree. It's always more interesting when we do. We had trouble disagreeing in our prep session,
Yeah,
but
indeed.
I think we'll get there. So why don't we start over there?
So Mark Williams, Geisinger, and perhaps not surprisingly, I'm going to be a bit provocative here. I know why you guys are here. It's, in my view, self-evident why this makes sense for you, because your business models are around knowledge management, knowledge transmission, validation of knowledge, and it makes great sense for you to want to share and take advantage of what everybody else is doing, because it's a mutually supportive. There's benefit for both sides to do this. In fact, in my view, Steve, we certainly have we don't send tests to laboratories that don't share data. I can't imagine why anybody wouldn't, given all we've heard. There are a couple of groups that aren't represented on your panel: diagnostics companies and pharma. Their model is, if I spend tens or hundreds of $1 million to develop sequence data, clinical data, my job is to discover something that is ultimately going to, have a place in the market with certain types of protection, patent or copyright or something that's going to, return that investment. I don't see the mutual beneficial nature of those individuals wanting to participate in data commons, where essentially $100 million of investment to generate the data goes out and anybody can use it at a fraction of that cost. So can you think about how we might be innovative so that we can have access to this data and yet still have companies be willing to put in that level of investment to generate the data that are clearly important for everybody?
Anyone?
Go ahead, Steve.
You're a
You-
diagnostic
You were called by
company.
name, so.
Yeah, so, intellectual property is of course an important issue, and it is an incentive for companies to develop stuff. It takes, at some level, a fair bit of courage to jump in and say, we think the pie will be bigger, and therefore our slice of the pie will be bigger if these data are broadly available, right? And, to be quite honest, we haven't yet proven that that is in fact a true hypothesis. So, come see if, I'm on this panel in 2 years, and I might tell you. But I think we believe in our hearts that there's a way to make that work. And obviously the Supreme Court, certainly in the area of genetics, has helped us by saying you can't patent genes and you can't block other people from offering tests on this. So there is not IP there. Clinical trials are a whole own situation, and I'm not the best expert to comment on that, but there have been various movements to try and make at least some of the clinical trials data more open as well, because the pharma companies hate surprises, right? I mean, you look at what happened recently with the clinical trial that Myriad was involved in for the HRD test for a PARP inhibitor, and their stock just dropped quite a lot because they got surprised. And, perhaps if more publicly available data on assays like that were available, that might not have happened, and they actually would have come out net ahead dollar-wise. I guess the key thing, though, is, in spite of the fact that all of us are businesses in various different parts of the sector, and many of you are as well, we're still in healthcare. And, you want to do the best job you can for your shareholders and everyone, who works in your company, but at the same time, in America, at the very least, for better or for worse, healthcare is a business. Most healthcare is privatized one way or another. And we still are trying to do the best job we can for the patient. And, you try and keep that balance as best as you can, but we at least always, and I know a number of other laboratorians, try and keep that top of mind. And, I love it when we see a case that we don't understand, and, as I mentioned on the slide, we'll call up a lab director at a competing laboratory, and most of them, even though our salespeople are duking it out in the field viciously against each other, we'll call up the lab director and say, hey, can you help us out with this case? I know you tested the family member. And we'll have a perfectly cordial conversation and try and do the right thing for the patient.
So I'll add a little bit into that. So, I guess my background, I'm 31 years old, live in Silicon Valley, started my company out of grad school at Stanford when I was 23 years old. If I wanted to make a quick billion as a Stanford 23-year-old, I would not be working in healthcare. So, just to say it. My motivation, and when you think about software companies in healthcare, generally the motivation is not purely monetary. So there is certainly a motivation around patient care that is paramount to many of our companies. There are software companies that are in similar spaces as ours that don't think that way. So there are companies that will go and take the patient's data and go sell it. And they'll sell it to help pharma companies do sales targeting. They'll sell it for research and drug discovery purposes. We all know that exists. So I wouldn't say that the divide is purely companies like ours versus pharma, et cetera. There are companies that are differently motivated that are in the same space. But on the question of the pharma company side, I mean, Mark, in some ways you're one of the most qualified, if not the most qualified person in the room to actually talk about these issues of health system, pharma alignment around data. So super curious what your thoughts are. But my basic premise around this is the health system is really in control of a lot of these relationships. And the health system should be going and determining the rules of the road with these pharmaceutical companies and making sure that if the pharma company wants to invest in data generation, that there's provisions in there for the data to be reused, to be shared for the good of the patients at that health system and beyond. So when we're working with some of the health systems that we partner with, that's one of the things that we think about. How do we productively engage with a biopharma party on data generation, but how do we assure that there are significant protections in place so that it's not a one-way street in the relationship? I won't say that we have it figured out, but it's something that we pay a lot of attention to.
So I'm going to agree, but I am going to disagree with one sort of tone that's easy to slip into, and it's easy, especially when we're here correctly cheering on the global values of data sharing for everyone's good. I, for one, don't think that we should mandate that everyone share everything, and I don't think that someone who decides to invest $1 million or $1 billion of their own capital to create some data that is making the world a better place shouldn't be allowed to make money and keep that on their own. I think that is one of the viable ways to move forward, and I think we should applaud anyone who's advancing the state of knowledge. Where I reserve my sort of moral indignation is for share washing, is for people who are pretending to do things for the greater good and aren't, is for people who are working against the interests of the patients that they are or participants that they are working with. So I think, as I personally think in many areas, I like markets with good labeling, right, with honest labeling around what people are doing and why they're doing it. So I think that it is completely legitimate for someone to set up a business where they decide to invest in some data and decide not to make all of that data available to everybody. even in that case, I think that there are an awful lot of reasons why the sort of sharing environment that we're creating is going to tilt the world towards where we want. Because it's usually not black or white. Even if somebody is trying to build a business model, Steve, as you pointed out, selfish business models are often well aligned with altruistic sharing for both optical reasons and morale reasons and pure business reasons.
And pure
So-
science reasons, yeah.
That's right. So what our job collectively is to do is to make it as easy as possible to share as widely as you want. So it is a simple policy decision away in the boardroom where they say, hey, you know that study we did, or you know that database that's already using Global Alliance standards and tools? Why don't we make it available to all qualified nonprofit researchers tomorrow? And then tomorrow, somebody just changes a line in a config file, and it's now available, and we all get to work on it. I want to live in a world where that's all that it takes. And then I want to let every boardroom make their own decision, and therefore, share washing goes away, because everyone knows that they are just one decision away from sharing it as widely as they choose to share it. And again, tying it back to patients. So that's how I'd add on to that. All right, I think next over there, and then back to you, John.
Thanks. Yeah, it's to the same point that you're speaking to. Another place where private industry can get involved is in pushing forward the science via the data model itself. So data sharing is important. However, in the case where data sharing is not ideal, if a new sequencer company arrives at some new chemistry, the best way to address the community, I believe, is through our data model. So although there are cases where data sharing might not make sense, I believe that in order to make sure that we all are working on the same science, we have to make it easy to become involved in pushing the model forward as well. And your thoughts on this as well?
No disagreement.
Yeah, no disagreement, although there is one catch-22 of data standards, which is they tend to get established, around things that people tend to commonly use today. So, as much as you try to anticipate the future, we all saw what happened when one took complete genomics data or ion torrent data and tried to represent it in BAM and run variant callers on it, is you got much less good variant calls than if you actually went back to the raw data in their own unique and non-standard formats. So there is a delicate balance there. I mean, I think standard formats for very process-reduced information are certainly important. But they always are going to lose some nuances of underlying new technologies because it just hasn't folded into standards yet.
Right, and so it's just making it easy for them to get involved, I would hope.
Yeah.
Or the
And
four of
that's-
you, actually.
Yeah, I look forward to, people like David, you probably have a lot of experience, Yuri, you have a lot of experience with how do you have data interchange standards that evolve rapidly as the underlying data are fundamentally changing.
Yeah, I don't think there's a silver bullet to how to do that. It's engage people early, and success will breed interest, right? If I were developing a novel new sequencing chemistry, I wouldn't be it wouldn't be very high on my list to interchange data with the emerging Global Alliance standards yet. I'd want to make it work first. But as soon as I made it work, and I saw a community of people who were actually tapping into the value of sequencing data using Global Alliance policies and standards, then I'd be hungry to crack into that and be part of the party.
Thank you.
John?
Yes, a quick comment and then a question. The comment is an irony, and that is since Airbnb was the analog used this morning for the NIH model of sharing, share washing has already been claimed for people who are just renting a room as per historical protocol and pretending that they're in the sharing economy. So a little irony there. The question I have is, and it's very much supported by David's comments about legitimate reasons, business reasons for investing and monetizing in that investment. It's almost a guarantee that as multi-omic decision support systems come forward, that there will be a lot of sort of a sparse matrix problem, that there will be multiple vendors who cover different territory that represent a sparse matrix for the full panorama. And in that situation, a clinician is likely going to want to have multiple vendors that have overlapping coverage of not just genomics, but the other omics that are in their particular sparse matrix. Do you have any thoughts of whether that's going to spawn a new industry of decision support integration engines, or how that might evolve in the industry?
Interesting.
I think I'll start with that one. I know John wanted to have a question that would generate some controversy. I would say that there is going to be a place in the future, I think, for partnering on expertise in certain areas of knowledge, and particularly when you're looking at omics, at many omics. And I think that will work itself out. I think it'll likely be more on the commercial side than just by setting up a standard, though it's possible that there'll be standards. But I think, clinicians do want very concise and simple delivery systems of messages, and if you're getting 5 different messages of very different types, it's very hard to use that as a clinician, particularly in real time, where you have very little time. So I think there has to be a way to take that knowledge, but yet deliver it in a way that the clinician doesn't have to worry so much about what source it came from.
I guess I'll add to that. No real disagreement. I think how this is going to manifest is a combination of 2 factors. So one is that the EMR systems are going to be forced to better support interoperability around decision support, clinical workflows, et cetera, which they're just starting to. They're not really great today, but they're going to be forced to do that by the physician user groups and the purchasers at health systems who control the dollars for their software in part. I think you're going to have 2 models of how this then works in terms of presentation to the clinician. One model, which is more of your kind of behind-the-scenes decision support, where the physician just gets a recommendation and they don't know where it comes from. And then the other model is a more immersive experience, where the physician's really going into a new space and a new clinical workflow to do their activity. And I don't think those models are in conflict. And I think what you're going to find is that the physician groups and health systems, as the physicians become more and more aligned in some sort of risk-bearing model, those groups are going to make the decisions about what tooling and what tool sets they use, which includes the decision support systems, back-end capabilities, et cetera. So I think you're going to have a robust world of CDS and knowledge-providing systems. And I think that's a world that everyone in this room should be thinking about and preparing for in terms of the data standards and knowledge standards that you want to see brought to the clinical environment. This is the group that's going to define that for the next few years.
Maybe if I can stick in a comment, and coming back to your comment about the 20-page faxes, keep in mind, I can't speak for every laboratory, but I know most of us in the laboratories hate sending 20-page faxes. Right? It's not something we do willingly. It's something we do because the ordering clinician says that's the only way I can get the test result.
Yep.
And so, our alternatives are, we say, okay, we can't help you help your patient, or we work around their limitation. Mm-hmm. It would be great if all of those problems can get solved. And I think the stuff you guys just talked about is going to be critical, but it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah. And there is an emerging thought as part of several of the national initiatives, including Cancer Moonshot, to start actually mandating electronic exchange of data on all sides related to genomic and genetic information. And wouldn't it be interesting if you started conditioning CMS reimbursement for testing and the subsequent drug that is utilized based on the test results on electronic receipt and storage of that data? So, that's one way to push this forward. Of course, another way is that the 2 sides of the equation get together and agree to do it, which is kind of what we're stuck in right now.
If I could add something about PDFs, I think it is true that most genomic reporting now is through a PDF that in electronic record still is a piece of paper in the back of the chart. I think you can argue that works well for single genes or a small panel or for a few medications, but it doesn't scale to the world we're facing of exome and whole genomics. And I think at that point you have to have decision support that's directly integrated and is not a set of PDFs. I think the knowledge may have to come from multiple sources, as John has pointed out, But I think a consistent interface for the clinicians can be very important.
This one last small thing to point out, because I want to get to the last couple of questions, is I think, as we've heard from these answers, a lot of the work that's happening here applies directly and is a necessary precursor to that multi-omics world. So we will have a smaller problem left to solve when the trouble is we have too much new kinds of knowledge, and we're trying to fit it into what's already a sustainable sharing environment. So.
Just a specific area about where I think the industry may be in position to help. If you use the example of sequencing instrument, so the industry has been actually leading the efforts to lower the cost. Through that lowering the cost, you get people actually start to pay more money into that area. We probably have a similar barrier for user in terms of using the software in the cloud environment. So maybe the industry side can also thinking about make the mapping file just 1/10 of the cost in the next 2 years. So anything you can do to help the consumer to lower the cost, lower the barrier, you will end up to get more money into that area. For sequencing instrument, you have an HERI actually has an initiative just constantly challenge the industry to do that. But we don't have that for the software or for the cloud. So somehow you guys can figure out a way when you're helping the consumers, you're helping yourself. It's just one comment about that area, because the software, if you want your software people to use, you have to make it so easy and relatively cheaper and getting cheaper all the time. That's where I think you will bring more customers into your area.
Well, I would say that I agree with you that as the cost of genomics falls, that it's going to become much more useful and much more widely available. And we have traditionally been on a curve where the cost is falling. It feels like some years it's been plateauing. Obviously, none of us here work, for example, for Illumina. But I do think the long-term trends are still that costs will come down. And as cost comes down, you're going to see genomics becoming very widely available, first in the developed world and then in the less developed world.
Yeah, we still live in a world where the cost of generating the data dwarfs the cost of doing more with the data, but that won't always be true. But it's still very much true. If we look at the cost of generating a new whole genome for a study versus the cost of storing that genome for a year or 5 years, the storage costs are rounding errors on the data acquisition costs. So I think the reason that industry is paying growing amounts of attention, not just us, the whole sector is growing in this space, is because everyone's looking forward and believes that this pie is going to get very large. And as a pie gets larger, then it's in all of our interests to do whatever we can to help it get larger and to add value, that we get our fair share of that pie. And one way you help it get larger is lowering friction, which is what we're talking about here. And anything that lowers friction is more energy and more money available for the fundamentals of taking better care of patients with better science.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add to that, and I agree with the previous comments, is that when you actually look at most of the common diagnostic tests that involve genetics and genomics today, the actual sequencing cost is actually a drop in the bucket relative to what the total cost of offering that test is. There's a lot of other costs. We heard about variant interpretation earlier. The billing is actually a shockingly large cost, and there are a bunch of others. So we're not actually limited by the laboratory technology as much as just the overall cost of delivery of those test results. I'm not saying cheaper sequencing isn't a good thing, and cheaper IT isn't a good thing, but you got to look at the big picture. I would like to end on one.
FedEx is not getting compressed by.
Well,
FedEx.
let me just add.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
Let me add one thing to that, which is, in the clinical environment, which is where many of us are operating in. If you look at the cost of the full sequencing and molecular diagnostic tests compared with the cost of the full care of the patient and the implications of the test, the cost of the test fully loaded is minuscule. I mean, you're comparing the, let's just say it's a $5,000 one-time molecular test to the $10,000 a month drug regimen.
Right.
So when you look at it from that perspective, we're all working together to drive down the cost of the test, but actually we need to be working on driving down the costs of all of the other components of care that add much more. And, you can make a very good argument that the cost of the test should actually be higher if you're preventing the utilization of some of those expensive drugs that aren't going to work, preventing hospitalizations, et cetera, et cetera. So, sorry.
Dr. Brooks?
Yeah, I'm really interested in the comment David made. He said it after the other three of you have spoken, but then you made a very clear statement that you think a market where someone pays to generate data, they should be allowed to sell that data or keep that data secret, because it's a market, but there's clear labeling. But that is that's one end of the spectrum. That company, investor, whatever, paid for the data, did it all themselves, it's their product, they can decide if they share it or not, versus some public funds pay for the data, and then we're arguing it should be released. The problem is there's loads and loads of data between those two models, right? The patient has a say in this, surely. The biobank needs to pay its running costs, and so on. You can come up with lots of different models. The researcher puts their time and life and reputation into these data. So there's lots of other people paying to generate data in many situations. And I'm wondering what David in particular, but maybe the others, would say, if you're going to accept those two extremes of the market as valid, how can you argue against any other person with any other mixed model of payment for data generation, not also charging for data?
I think the goal is create the most knowledge, create the most good, right? And whatever is sustainable that allows that to happen. And there isn't, I'm not going to pretend I know the taxonomy of all the right ways to do that, because I think picking the endpoints is, as you pointed out, is illustrative of different examples. But I think that in all cases, the sorts of standards and policies and tools that we are talking about here make it all work better. And they make every point on that, if it's one of those frontier curves, shifting the curve is always a good thing. And then, once the curve is shifted, we can talk about, do we want to encourage one side of that? And there are all sorts of funding organizations in the room who are doing interesting things to say, for societal reasons, we are going to invest to shift it towards a more shared, more centrally funded model, and that's a good answer. But I don't think that answer should preclude other answers along the curve.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add to what David just said, though, is that, it's one thing if someone does take their own money and invest it in building something, they should be able to do with that data what they want. Although, again, the consumer has the right to vote with their feet, right? Who has the business policies of the folks they want to work with. I will remind you that in some contexts, say, for example, a laboratory that has done lots and lots and lots of testing and keeps all the information about those tests proprietary, they didn't pay for those tests. Those tests were paid for by the healthcare system, right? They were not paid for by that company. Perhaps a very small initial fraction were. And so in that case, you might have a slightly different perspective on, what people, to use a pejorative word, should do. And, the people who really get to control that, maybe the regulators in some countries, not likely to be the case in America, but are certainly the healthcare payers, right? They can say, look, you're welcome to do with the data whatever you want, but we're willing to pay you if, and set policies that way.
And
All right,
we're getting
I'm getting the hook here, so thank you all for making this a good conversation. We found some controversy, which was the goal.
all right.